Hi, I'm Colin Seal, founder and CEO of thinkLaw. Welcome to Lesson 11, The Fox and the Ball, Part 1. This is another one of those two-part lesson series that you could break into two parts if you're doing, a shorter period, or if you have a longer block of time where you're dealing with thinkers, you can combine lessons 11 and 12 into one full lesson. So the outline here is we're actually taking the Draw plus C framework and really going through the components of it and spending a lot of time working on those individual sections. Um, in this case, what we're doing is where the outline is we start with this question of when do certain items become yours? How and when do they become yours? One of those legal nuances that folks don't normally think about, but it's important to the decisions that we're looking at in lesson 11 and 12 here. And then we're looking at a really famous case called the Fox case to talk about when a hunter develops rights in a wild animal. And we're going to be using that Draw plus C framework both in lessons 11 and 12 to practice this out. So again, right, this is a lot about where do we draw our evidence from? How do we make our public policy arguments into convincing reasons to support our case and to go against another interpretation of how our case should be decided? Um, to start out with, then, we have this interesting thing starter about how and when these certain items become yours. Very interesting. We have these probing questions here, but it's more general. What I'm telling you is to say, really push students to say how and why. So for instance, you might talk about a pair of shoes. You might say, okay, a pair of shoes becomes yours when you buy it. And when does it become yours? At the actual moment you buy it. Well, what about if you don't buy it and someone else buys it and gives it to you as a gift? When does it become yours at that point, right? Now there's a gap between the point where it becomes purchased and the point where it actually becomes yours. What if you find a pair of shoes? Well, maybe it's not yours at the time you first find it, because maybe it might belong to somebody else and you might come and get it. But maybe after a little while it becomes yours after you know someone's not going to get it, right? So that's an example of how this might be a little bit more complex than it seems when you first look at it, but just kind of pushing them on it, which really happens when you look at a dog. The dog example is a really good one of when does a dog become yours. It makes them see that property ownership is a little bit more complicated than you might think, which brings us to this famous case that involves a teacher and a hunter fighting over who owns a fox. Pretty weird to be fighting over a fox. A fox has never been a very expensive item, but in this case, as I give you in the background information, these families both had a lot of money. So this was it was about more than just the fox, right? But in any case, the question is, how and when does a wild animal become yours? So we actually are forcing our thinkers to think about it from both perspectives, right? What are some reasons the fox should belong to Lodowick versus belonging to Jesse? And then again, stepping back to that big picture, what's weird about this case, right? Well, we're not telling students initially that they have this wealthy background, but students should be very questionable as to why these people are fighting over a silly fox that you could probably find dozens of them at this time in this place where they were hunting. So it's important, again, to always think about what context you're working in when you're coming up with this sort of a case. So we actually give them the rule. And again, try to make sure that they're not looking too far ahead here. And we say, well, a wild animal is owned when you do something to subdue it, right? Do something to bring it into your control. You trap it, or you wound it, or you kill it. You do something to make it yours. So now we're actually thinking about this rule of like, is that a good rule? Does that rule work when we're talking about hunters? Well, what would the alternative be? Would be the good way to analyze whether or not that worked. If it was the case that anybody can just go saying, well, I saw that animal, it was mine, then almost every hunter would say that when a deer got away from them, or it just wouldn't be a really sustainable way to administer the world of hunting. You probably need a rule that makes it a little bit clearer what's what and what belongs to who. So that brings us to the Draw plus C framework. Again, the D stands for who should win, right? Writing a decision in a clear way. The R is the rule of the law. What's the rule of law supporting what you're doing? What are the arguments on both sides? What is that big picture world conclusion, implication of what's happening? And then you're just rewriting your decision as a conclusion, incorporating what you've already said and not introducing any new evidence. So we've already kind of worked out the nuances of how this case should work. At this point, what this lesson does is just give you a practice of the mechanics of it. Right? We're just practicing writing out a decision, writing out the arguments on both sides, and then the world and a conclusion. So it's just really teeing up lesson 12, but that's the real purpose here. We really want to make sure that they're able to come up with a rational way to explain this in a way that's going to hit all these points. So maybe they weren't doing this when they did lesson 10, which was the formative assessment. Maybe they didn't do this when they did lesson 1, which is the diagnostic assessment. But at this point, we really want to spend that time to be very, very specific about hitting each one of those categories. Okay? So that actually is the end of lesson 11, and it wraps up just with this case because, like I said, it kind of tees over right into lesson 12. The time constraints, if you have a shorter period, this just kind of ends right here, but then you start up with lesson 12 the next time, or you can just continue if it's part of what you're already doing. Okay, next video will be lesson 12, Fox in the Ball Part 2.